The most haunting paradox of history is that to become the only truly living heir of a grand dynasty, one must first be utterly erased from its collective memory. On the 12th of July in the year 1856, at the summer residence of Luxembourg, Archduchess Gisela was born into a world where her very arrival was a quiet failure of expectations. She was the second daughter in a court that was feverishly desperate for a male heir, a pawn on a chessboard she was too small to see. Yet she possessed an instinct for survival that far outpaced her years. Her mother, the legendary Empress Elizabeth, known to the world as Sissi, was a woman who felt the cold chains of the Habsburg protocol tightening around her throat. Yet she was powerless to even choose a name for the life she had brought into the world. From her very first breath, Gisela was caught in the crossfire of a silent, bitter war between two of the most formidable women in Europe. While her mother fought a losing battle for her own autonomy, her grandmother, the indomitable Archduchess Sophie, stepped into the nursery like a conquering general, claiming the child as state property. Gisela may not have known how to speak yet, but she understood the lay of the land with a terrifying clarity. In this palace, love was a currency she simply did not possess. She became a child of the shadows, a witness to a domestic tragedy that played out behind closed doors and gilded mirrors. While Sissi was in the next room, punishing her own flesh and blood through bouts of starvation and obsessive exercise in a desperate bid to regain control over the only thing she had left, her own body, little Gisela was teaching herself the art of vanishing into thin air. She learned to hold her breath to avoid disturbing the oppressive silence of the Hofburg, and she instinctively hid her trembling hands behind her back, refusing to let her fear become a target for the judgment of the court. She was never meant to be the star of the show. She was merely a piece of the furniture in a grand drama of state. By becoming a functional ghost, she navigated the razor-thin line between her mother's erratic melancholy and her grandmother's iron discipline. She understood that to survive the suffocating atmosphere of the Viennese court, she had to stop existing as a person and start existing as a convenience. She became the child who caused no trouble, the girl who left no footprints on the polished parquet floors, and the daughter who never asked for the affection that was being hoarded for a future that might never come. In the heart of the Habsburg machine, Gisela grew up in the quiet, learning that the safest place to be was exactly where no one was looking, carving out a life for herself in the margins of a story that was already beginning to tear itself apart. This was the era of the gilded cage, where every smile was rehearsed and every tear was a betrayal of the crown. Gisela saw how her mother's beauty became her prison, and how her grandmother's power became her shroud. In this world of high stakes and low blows, the little Archduchess realized that the only way to win the game was to refuse to play it. She would not be the exotic orchid her mother was, nor the iron statue her grandmother had become. Instead, she would be the ghost in the machine, the one who saw everything, felt everything, yet remained untouched by the madness that was slowly consuming the House of Austria. The breaking point arrived in the year 1857, a year when the air over Budapest grew thick with the stifling heat of fever and the sharp, acidic stench of vinegar-soaked rags. It was a journey born of a mother's desperate bid for agency. Empress Elizabeth, suffocating under the iron thumb of the Viennese court, had dug her heels in and insisted on a state visit to Hungary. She wanted to prove she was more than a decorative bird in a gilded cage. She wanted to be a mother on her own terms. It was a fatal victory. Against the frantic warnings of the palace physicians and the biting disapproval of Archduchess Sophie, Sisi took her daughters, the infant Gisela and the 2-year-old Sophie, into the heart of the empire. But fate has a cruel way of punishing rebellion. As the carriage rattled through the dusty plains, a shadow fell over the nursery. Both girls were seized by a violent wasting sickness that turned their nurseries into infirmaries. In the dimly lit chambers, the air was heavy with the sounds of laboured breathing and the futile prayers of a shattered court. While the tiny, resilient Gisela clung to life with a grit no one knew she possessed, her older sister withered away like a plucked flower. On the 29th of May, little Sophie breathed her last in her mother's arms, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very foundations of the monarchy. For the Empress, until the grief was not just a heartbreak, it was a physical amputation. The weight of the guilt was bone deep, a visceral agony that settled in her marrow and refused to leave. When she looked at her surviving daughter, the healthy, breathing Gisela, she saw not a miracle, but a haunting. To Sissi, every beat of Gisela's heart was an echo of the one that had stopped, and every healthy cry was a jagged reminder of the silence in the other cradle. The sight of Gisela became a form of torture, a living, breathing testament to Sissi's own failure and the catastrophic price of her defiance. Unable to bear the crushing gravity of her own reflection in the child's eyes, the Empress simply checked out. She underwent a total emotional abdication, turning her back on the nursery and retreating into a hollow shell of desolation. She handed Gisela back to the Iron Archduchess, a silent surrender that whispered to the world that she had been broken. In that cold exchange, Gisela became an orphan with living parents. She was left to navigate the corridors of power alone, forever staring into the living but entirely empty eyes of a mother who had chosen to become a ghost long before she ever reached the grave. The warmth of a mother's touch was replaced by the rigid, unyielding embrace of protocol, leaving Gisela to understand that in the House of Habsburg, survival was the ultimate betrayal. She stood in the wake of a storm that had washed away her mother's love, leaving nothing behind but the salt of tears and the frozen stone of a duty she never asked for. While Gisela learned to hold her breath in the deepening shadows of the palace corridors, her mother was busy waging a relentless, silent war against her own flesh, transforming her body into the final, impregnable fortress of her sovereignty. It was a struggle of a very particular kind, what modern eyes might recognize as a desperate, anorectic protest against a world that had stripped her of every other form of agency. Elizabeth, the woman the world worshipped as a porcelain icon, had discovered that if she could not command the empire or the upbringing of her own children, she could at least command the exact circumference of her waist. She would retreat into her private chambers, where the air was thick with the scent of violet water and the metallic tang of the gymnasium, to undergo rituals that bordered on the macabre. The Empress would have herself stitched into her riding habits, a process so exacting that it left no room for a single stray fold or a human breath, cinching her corset until her waist was reduced to a 16-inch noose. This 40-centimetre diameter was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was a physical barrier, a way to separate her spirit from the suffocating atmosphere of the Viennese court. Her bedroom, once a sanctuary, had been converted into a gilded torture chamber of her own making. Gymnastic rings hung from the ceiling, and parallel bars stood where one might expect to find comfortable chaise longues. Here, Elizabeth would spend hours in a state of frantic motion, swinging from the rings and fencing with an intensity that left her ladies in waiting gasping for air. These were her personal racks, her own versions of the medieval strappado, upon which she sacrificed her health to maintain a ghostly, ethereal thinness. At night, the rituals took an even darker turn. To preserve the legendary elasticity of her skin, she would sleep without a pillow on a rigid metal bed frame, her face draped in masks of raw, pounded veal or crushed strawberries, turning her visage into a literal mask of sacrificial meat. She sought to shed her humanity, to burn away every ounce of soft, maternal warmth until she was nothing more than an elusive, fairy-like creature that was entirely inaccessible to state contact or domestic duty. Her diet became a mechanical exercise in deprivation. She eschewed the grand banquets of the Hofburg, choosing instead to subsist on a thin, sanguine extract of meat juice squeezed from raw steaks, supplemented only by occasional glasses of milk and bowls of violet ice cream. She was effectively erasing her physical presence, weighing herself 3 times a day with a devotion that bordered on religious mania. Terrified that a single extra pound would anchor her to the reality she so despised. Yet this war for control had a secondary, more devastating front. Her relationship with her daughter, Gisela, who was growing up with the solid, dependable frame and the distinct, heavy jaw of the Habsburgs, became the unintentional casualty of her mother's aesthetic crusade. Elizabeth, who could not forgive herself for her own perceived failures, could certainly not forgive her daughter for looking so tragically ordinary. In the privacy of her diaries and the biting rhythm of her poems, the Empress was a far cry from the doting mother the public imagined. She poured her venom onto the page, referring to the adolescent Gisela as a scrawny sow and mocking her lack of grace. To Elizabeth, Gisela was not a child to be nurtured, but a living, breathing reminder of the bad years, a physical manifestation of the crushing weight of the Habsburg name and the years of subordination to Archduchess Sophie. The girl was a square peg in the round hole of her mother Wittelsbach vanity, a solid creature of earth and duty born to a woman who wished to be made of nothing but air and light. Every time Gisela entered a room, she was met not with a mother's embrace, but with a cold, appraising stare that measured her failures against an impossible standard of beauty. The Empress would look through her daughter as if she were a blemish on a masterpiece, a piece of occupied territory that she had decided to burn to the ground through a policy of total oblivion. While Rudolf, the heir, was subjected to a different kind of masculine torment, Gisela was simply deleted from her mother M's emotional map. She was the ghost at the feast, the silent witness to the Empress's slow-motion collapse into a world of mirrors and exercise bars. Elizabeth used her beauty as a weapon of isolation, a way to build a wall between herself and the people who claimed to love her. And Gisela was the first person to find herself on the wrong side of that wall. The child learned to navigate this minefield of maternal neglect by making herself as small and as quiet as possible, understanding that in her mother's eyes, her very existence was an affront to the cult of perfection. The Hofburg, with its miles of red carpet and its thousands of flickering candles, became a place where a young girl had to learn to tiptoe around the jagged edges of a mother's broken psyche. Gisela saw the raw meat, she heard the frantic creaking of the gymnastic rings, and she felt the icy wind that followed the Empress as she swept through the halls on one of her legendary high-speed power walks. She knew that she could never compete with the ghost of her dead sister or the impossible standard of her mother as waistline, and so she retreated further into herself, becoming the functional ghost her environment demanded. She was the collateral damage of a sovereign woman's attempt to reclaim her soul by destroying her body. A child who had to find a way to survive in a house where the most beautiful woman in the world was also the most dangerous stranger. Elizabeth's pursuit of the sublime had left no room for the mundane reality of a daughter's love. And so Gisela was left to wither in the shade of a legend, a girl whose only crime was being made of flesh and bone in a world that worshipped only marble and air. By the time she reached her teenage years, the distance between them was an ocean of unspoken grievances and aesthetic disdain, a gap that no amount of protocol could ever hope to bridge. Gisela was the daughter of the earth, watching her mother slowly drift away into a stratosphere of her own making, leaving behind a trail of bitter poems and empty nurseries. In the grand, tragic narrative of the Habsburgs, this was the silent chapter, the one where a mother's obsession with her own reflection became the mirror that shattered her daughter's heart. In the year 1867 to use, the shifting tides of the Habsburg Empire brought a new, blinding light into the Empress's life. But for Gisela, it was the final cooling of the sun. Sissi had found her ultimate redemption in the birth of Marie Valerie, the child she heralded as the only one who truly belonged to her, raising the infant far from the cold stones of Vienna in the open air of Hungary. This favoritism was not merely a preference, it was a loud public declaration that Gisela and her brother Rudolf were remnants of a past their mother wished to delete from her memory. At 16, Gisela had become an inconvenient footnote in her mother's meticulously curated legend. She was a living reminder of the years of subordination. A girl who looked too much like the grandmother Sissi despised, and too little like the ethereal fairy tale queen the public adored. The Empress, who was becoming increasingly obsessed with maintaining the illusion of eternal youth, viewed her teenage daughter not with affection, but with the cold anxiety of a woman seeing a ticking clock. A grown daughter meant that Sissi was no longer the centerpiece of the court. It meant that grandmotherhood was looming over the horizon, a reality her narcissism could not stomach. Thus, the wheels of state were turned to orchestrate what can only be described as a polite, strategic deportation. Gisela was married off to Prince Leopold of Bavaria in a maneuver that was executed with the mechanical efficiency of a house cleaning. Sissi was conspicuously absent from the bridal preparations. Her manic energy focused on her own escape, casting a shadow of profound indifference over the ceremony that should have been her daughter's transition to womanhood. She even managed to eclipse the bride at the altar, her own beauty a weapon that made the pale, trembling Gisela look like a common extra in a grand, tragic play. But as the carriage rattled away toward Munich, Gisela discovered a secret her mother would never grasp: that being discarded can sometimes be the most profound form of liberation. In the kingdom of Bavaria, the air was different. It was lighter, unburdened by the crushing gravity of the Spanish court etiquette. Gisela walked out of the gilded cage of the Hofburg and straight into the warmth of a reality she had only ever seen from the windows of her high-walled nursery. While her mother was busy hiding her aging face behind leather fans and heavy veils, practicing a desperate form of self-presentation through absolute absence, Gisela decided to open her face to the world. Her new life in Munich became her own quiet, daring revolution against the Habsburg madness. She traded the suffocating silence of her childhood for a palace that finally smelled like a home. Her rooms no longer carried the metallic, bloody scent of raw veal masks or the sharp, acidic bite of vinegar-soaked rags that characterized her mother's quarters. Instead, they began to smell of fresh baking, of warm hearths, and the honest, uncomplicated scent of children's laughter. She became the mother she had never known, nursing her own infants and mending their clothes with a grounded, practical love that had no room for gymnastic rings or starving diets. She broke the ancestral chain of trauma by choosing the ordinary over the sublime, proving that a life built on duty and kindness is far more resilient than one built on vanity and flight. The people of Munich began to whisper her name with a different kind of reverence, calling her the Good Angel, not because she was a distant, untouchable idol, but because she was a neighbor who understood the grit of real life. She found her sovereignty in attachment, in the sticky hands of her children, and the steady gaze of a husband who valued her for her soul rather than her silhouette. While Sissi fled across oceans to escape her own mind, sinking deeper into a world of mirrors and isolation, Gisela was building a bridge to the future. She reclaimed her identity by embracing the very mundane duties her mother fled from, proving that happiness is not found in the pursuit of an impossible ideal, but in the courage to be present in the messy, beautiful reality of the everyday. The ultimate irony of the story was that the daughter who was pushed aside for being too plain became the only one whose life actually mattered to the living, a resilient wildflower that bloomed in the cracks of a crumbling empire, while Sissi's world was a temple of beauty that required the constant sacrifice of her family's happiness. Gisela's world was a sanctuary of peace. She saw the writing on the wall for the monarchy long before the first cannons of war were fired, and she prepared herself not by hoarding jewels, but by cultivating a character that did not depend on a title. Her revolution of normalcy was a silent accusation against the brilliant, destructive fire of her mother's existence. By the time the dust of history settled, it was clear that the boring daughter was the only one who had truly mastered the art of living, transforming her exile into a kingdom of the heart that no revolution could ever tear down. The final act of the grand Habsburg drama reached its crescendo in the year 1898 on the serene promenades of Geneva, a place where the world around the Empress suddenly fell into a haunting, airless silence under the silent strike of an anarchist. When the sharpened file of her assassin pierced her heart, Elizabeth did not even cry out. She merely stumbled, unaware that the thread of her life had been severed by a man who could not even afford a proper dagger. The irony of her fate was as visceral as it was cruel, for her life was prolonged for a few agonizing minutes by the very instrument that had been her lifelong tormentor, the corset. It gripped her body with such ferocious intensity, its steel ribs acting as a makeshift tourniquet, that it refused to let her blood escape into the open air, keeping her upright and moving even as her heart was failing. She died exactly as she had lived, cinched into an impossible image, trapped within a cage of her own making, and utterly incapable of taking one last, unburdened breath of freedom. While the world of Sissi began to crystallize into cold, untouchable marble, transforming her into a tragic icon for the masses to worship from a distance, her daughter Gisela was preparing to face a reality that was far more abrasive than any palace intrigue. As the century turned and the shadow of the year 1914 began to loom over the continent, the glittering illusions of the old world started to crumble into dust. While other archduchesses and princesses were feverishly packing their family jewels and fleeing toward the safety of their country estates, Gisela performed a radical act of presence. She stripped away the heavy silks and the status that had once defined her, trading them for the coarse, unforgiving linen of a nurse's uniform. She did not merely patronize a cause, she became the cause, turning her magnificent palace in Munich into a bustling military hospital, a place of grit and sorrow that stood in stark contrast to the sterile halls of her youth. In the grand ballrooms where she was once expected to dance like a marionette, she now stood amidst the heavy, suffocating scent of iodine, the sharp tang of iron, and the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies. There, the daughter of the emperor spent her days and nights washing blood-stained bandages with her own hands, her fingers growing raw and calloused from the labor that her mother would have found beneath her dignity. Where Elizabeth had seen the world only as a backdrop for her own escape into a realm of poetry and dreams, Gisela saw it as a theatre for action. She became the only living anchor in the raging fire of history, holding the hands of dying soldiers who had no idea that the woman comforting them was the granddaughter of a woman who once ruled half of Europe. She did not flinch from the reality of the trenches. She immersed herself in it, proving that her strength was not a byproduct of her title, but a fundamental part of her soul. While her mother's legacy was being woven into a fairy tale of sorrowful beauty, Gisela's legacy was being written in the hospital ledgers and the grateful eyes of the broken men she tended to. She stood firm as the empire of her father began to disintegrate into ash, refusing to retreat into the narcissistic isolation that had consumed her mother. She understood that in a world gone mad, the only way to remain sane was to be useful, to be grounded, and to be real. By the time the final dominoes of the monarchy fell, Gisela had already transitioned from a relic of the past into a pillar of the present, her quiet heroism serving as a silent, devastating indictment of the brilliant but destructive madness that had defined her family for generations. She was the one who stayed when everyone else fled, the one who worked when everyone else mourned, and the one who survived the storm not by running from it, but by standing directly in its path. The true shock reveals itself only in the deep, resonant silence of history, where we come to realize that Archduchess Gisela was systematically edited out of the Habsburg narrative for the most unforgivable of reasons. She was the only one who actually won their lethal game. While her brother Rudolf succumbed to his own demons in 1889, leaving a trail of blood and shattered hopes in the lodge at Meierling, and while her mother, Elizabeth, drifted further into the ether as a self-styled professional wanderer, eventually regarded as the most dangerous foreigner in her own lands, Gisela was busy mastering the art of the long game. The writing was on the wall for the monarchy long before the final bells tolled, but Gisela was the only one who had the foresight to build a bridge to the new world instead of setting fire to the old one. In the pivotal year of 1918, as the map of Europe was being redrawn in the wake of the Great War and the once mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire began to disintegrate into a patchwork of new nations, Gisela did not retreat into a bitter, aristocratic exile. She did not spend her final years suing for lost palaces or clinging to the phantom protocols of a vanished court. Instead, she performed the most radical act of all. She chose to belong to the present. In 1919, as the dust was still settling on the ruins of the monarchy, she was among the first women to walk into a polling station and cast her vote in the new republic. This was not merely a political gesture. It was the ultimate proof of her survival. She had outlasted the gilded cage, outlived the narcissistic beauty of her mother, and outmaneuvered the tragic destiny that had consumed her siblings. While the rest of her family had been busy chasing shadows or drowning in their own neuroses, Gisela had been cultivating a legacy of substance. The profound sense of awe comes from the realization that while the statues of Sissi today are nothing more than cold, lifeless marble, beautiful icons for a world that loves its tragedies neat and aestheticized, the blood of Gisela continues to flow through the veins of living descendants who have successfully integrated into the modern world. She was the only genetic and psychological bridge that survived the storm. She did not run from the pain of her childhood or the neglect of her mother. She repurposed that pain, turning it into a foundation for a life of service and stability. When the socialist revolution swept through Munich, she stood her ground, earning the respect of the very people who sought to dismantle her class because she had already proven her worth in the hospital wards and soup kitchens. Her forgotten happy ending to the which concluded with a peaceful death in 1932, at the age of 76, serves as the most quiet and devastating indictment of her family is brilliant, destructive madness. She proved that the Habsburg curse was not an unavoidable fate, but a lifestyle choice that she simply refused to make. In the final accounting of history, Gisela stands as a powerful reminder that in a world gone mad, the most revolutionary act a human can commit is to be kind, to be steady, and to be real. She was the resilient wildflower that managed to bloom in the cracks of a crumbling empire, outlasting the exotic orchids that had once overshadowed her. Her story is the victory of the mundane over the sublime, a testament to the fact that while beauty might capture the eye, it is character that inherits the future. She lived to see the dawn of a new era, not as a relic of a bygone age, but as a woman who had mastered the art of being human in a house that worshipped only ghosts. Her legacy is not found in the museums of Vienna, but in the living, breathing reality of a family that escaped the darkness of the Hofburg to find the light of a normal life. This was her ultimate rebellion. She stayed true to herself when the world demanded she be a myth. And in doing so, she became the only one who truly won.